Well, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Cameron Byrne, General Manager of Partnerships and Memberships here at the AFA. I would like to introduce you to today's webinar, Helping the Men in Your Life, as well as yourself, brought to you in partnership with Mantle. This is an informative session designed for everyone who has a man in their life. We'll be covering off informal and relevant discussions on what do we know about men's mental health, overcoming typical barriers to support, supporting your own mental health as well as those of others, how to care, not to carry, when, how, and where to refer people for additional support. I'd like to introduce you today to our guest speaker, Dr. David Anthony, CEO of Mantle. With his extensive experience in a range of male-dominated environments, Dr. David's passion is changing the way men do mental health and improving their quality of life. His doctorate involved exploring the physiological factors that led to the enhancement of human functioning and developing strategies for enhancing performance with the West Coast Eagles, for those of you that follow AFL. Dr. David enjoys learning and continues to be involved in and incorporating research into his practice, ensuring his professional approach follows the most up-to-date empirical methods. Before we begin, I'd just like to cover off some housekeeping. CPD will be available and the AFA will send out details within the week. As a webinar attendee, you will remain on mute throughout the session. For those of you, we encourage you to submit questions. Questions will be answered at the end of the presentation. Please use the Zoom Q&A function and not the chat function. Thank you, Dr. David, for putting this important information together to help our members and those with men in their life. I will now hand over to Dr. David to take you through the session. I hope you enjoy it.
Cam, thanks so much for the introduction there. Ladies and gentlemen, great to be here. As Cam identified, I think, you know, for me, I want to thank you for making the time for this opportunity, not only to consider each of your roles in building the mental health of those closest to you, but also as a means to better maintain your own mental health and reflect on the existing skills that you use and how you might add to those. It really importantly, before I talk about why I do what I do, I just wanted to do a welcome to country. You know, we'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the lands on which we gather today and pay our respects to their elders past and present. We extend that respect to the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples joining us today. I'm coming at you from the Kabi Gabi lands up on the Sunshine Coast, and essentially, as Cam identified, I'm the Chief Executive and Co-founder of Mental Health. And why I do what I do, Cam talked about my bio there, but essentially I work in psychology, I work in mental health because it's always been an area of interest to me since, you know, my early 20s. I couldn't tell you what psychology was when I finished school, but I was lucky enough to be involved in some Rotary programs that really exposed me to the value of psychology, not just from this notion of assisting individuals as moving from, you know, not so good to good, but also about this prospect of moving from good to great using similar theories. And that's where I've sort of invested my time and my career. I've been fortunate enough to work as an army psychologist around Australia and overseas. I've been fortunate enough to work in high performance settings and across a range of corporate environments as well. And the thing that I love most about what I do, you know, why I truly do what I do, is I continue to learn every day, regardless of whether it's running groups, webinars like this, or whether it's working one-on-one with clients. I really enjoy the opportunity to think about how I apply the knowledge that I have differently, and also, you know, learn from others' experiences as much as hopefully they learn from me. So Cam went through the outline there, but you know, the engagement expectations, I guess for mine is, you know, please shut down your emails for the next hour. You know, turn your phones on silent or put them face down if you're not expecting any calls. Ask questions throughout in the Q&A function. We'll get to them at the end, but there'll be a couple of questions that I'll throw up on the slides. And if you would like to contribute, please feel free to respond in the chat function there. So chat for in-house questions throughout the presentation, and then Q&A for any questions that you want to throw out at the end of the presentation. A little bit of a content warning. We are talking about mental ill health and will make reference to suicide. So if you find yourself experiencing heightened emotions as a result of your own experiences, whether it be your own or those close to you, that's okay. Please ensure that you check in with your trusted supports or professional services after the session as required. So kicking off, looking at the men's mental health landscape, essentially what do we do at Mantle? Mantle was founded because my own anecdotal experience and that of my co-founders was that the way that we did psychology, the way that we're trained in psychology, didn't really relate or wasn't as effective as it should be for working with men. And so we set about identifying, well, what are the unique gendered approaches that might be required in psychology settings, and how do we ensure that when we're talking about men's mental health, we're looking at how they might be applied by all of us in the population, whether it's supporting our partners, whether it's supporting our brothers, our other family members, whether it's looking at our leaders or our colleagues, essentially helping them to be the best they can be. That's what we're going to go through today. But why do we do what we do? The research tells us that the current system doesn't necessarily work as effectively for men, but we all have a role to play in changing the dialogue around mental health, and more specifically men's mental health. Why do we do it? Well, 50% of men will experience mental ill health or illness at some stage in their life. 1 in 10 new dads will experience postnatal depression and anxiety. And critically, 7 of 9 suicides per day in Australia are men. Now, that equates to every 3 hours someone in Australia taking their own life. Interestingly, 60% of men that do attempt suicide have had contact with a health provider in the year before that suicide attempt. And the highest at-risk category age group is 45 to 49 years. It's closely followed by those over 85. Now, if we look at the engagement rates, we know 50 to 70% of men with mental illness do not seek professional support. But one of the standout stats for me, and one of the reasons why we established Mantle as a one-on-one video telehealth psychology service primarily for men, was this notion that 43% of men regret asking for help because it didn't meet their expectations. Now, for mine, the critical consideration there is it's not just about those professional services, but this was also in relation to reaching out to a friend or a family member or a work colleague and not really getting the support they were hoping for. And the reason I raise that is I think it's critical that we identify that this isn't just about the capacity to ask for help. It's also about the capacity to provide help and provide the type of support that we know is most effective in most situations. And we'll talk about that a little bit later on. I was lucky enough to have a look at the AFO 2021 Wellbeing Report, looking at a sample of over 700 advisors, 78% of which were male. And I think, if we compare the industry stats to what we're seeing up on the slides there, 73% of advisors are experiencing high levels of burnout from work. 61% have poor sleep at times due to stress. And importantly, 17% of advisors said they were depressed most of the time or all of the time. Now, for mine, I think it's really important that we start to consider, whilst, if we look at the stats and say, well, 50% of people will experience mental illness at some stage in their lives. One, it highlights to me that it is a little more common than we might think. And two, it's actually quite I don't want to say a normal life experience, but it's one of those things that a lot of us experience. And therefore, often when we do experience periods of mental ill health or illness, we don't always consider how it's actually a shared experience as other people that are going through it. And we'll talk more about that as we move through. But first question for the chat box, of course, and Cam will help us read out here the answers, but I'd love to hear, when you hear the term mental health, I'd love to see some ideas as to what comes to mind. What are the phrases or the labels that that come to mind when you hear the term mental health?
Sorry, I was on mute there. Rookie error.
Oh,
Other
good, Cam.
comments have come through in the chat, which is really good. How you cope with positive and negative stress, depression, anxiety, how well someone copes, depression. So there's a common theme: depression, anxiety, and stress. Mental fitness.
Yeah.
So, which is a good one. Everyone thinks of physical fitness, but mental fitness is, which I'm sure you'll attest to, is just as important.
Yeah, there's some great ideas there, Cam, isn't there? I know Brad throws out loneliness there, Brad Fox, and I think when we think about this term, mental health, it's actually it's really important to identify that the term mental health is by definition an adaptive construct. And much like physical health, as Cam identified, it should be sort of identified as something that is sustaining, that is protective. The definition from the World Health Organization is a state of well-being in which the individual realizes his or her own abilities, can cope with normal stresses of life, can work productively and fruitfully, and is able to make a contribution to his or her community. Now, that's important to remember in the context of the way that we normally look at mental health. And we're not saying that there's an incorrect way to look at it, but we've sort of developed this association that mental health is often bad. And despite the ongoing learnings and increased awareness in this area, I think it's really important that we think about how we communicate this, because the definition of a mental illness is a health problem that significantly affects how a person feels, thinks, behaves, and interacts with other people. And we've got Corey Keyes' diagram up there on the screen. And the reason I like to throw this up there is because what it helps us identify, we've got the mental health continuum running vertically, and we've got the mental illness continuum running horizontally. And to me, the critical factor that this diagram helps identify is we can still experience mental illness and be mentally healthy. And a lot of the time we don't factor that in. We see mental illness as something that might be terminal, in inverted commas. And look, for some people with a significant diagnosis, it does require a significant change in lifestyle. But for the majority of us, we actually can learn strategies and processes to assist us in coping with those challenges that may have resulted in us in experiencing mental illness. And so just as we can still live a healthy life with diabetes, we can also live a mentally healthy life when we work hard at developing the strategies to manage the effects of the illness we may be diagnosed with. But if we don't, if we're not mentally healthy and we're sort of down around the bottom of that vertical continuum, then the longer that we spend down on that vertical continuum, the more likely we're going to end up sort of to the left of the mental illness continuum there as well. And that's an important factor to highlight as well, much like it is with other illnesses. So perhaps if we get better at differentiating between mental health, which is a 5-in-5 approach to the way we might look at our workplaces or our social groups or whatever it might be, as opposed to mental illness, which is a 1-in-5 approach, according to the stats. We have the capacity to assist in breaking down the barriers, not just for ourselves, but for those around us. And we'll talk more about that. But what are our common issues? This isn't just about mental illness, but if we think about the diagram from Keyes, it's the more reported issues that people are languishing. These are the things that they're reporting that they're struggling with. And while they may be considered challenging to each of us, I think the critical thing to remember here is, we don't always consider how we might address these issues early. If it's sort of something that's resulting in a little bit of a slide down that vertical continuum, what are the ways that we might to address those concerns before they become significant? And again, if we look at the gendered lens here, a lot of the times men will will avoid dealing with these things early. They will leave it until it becomes much more difficult to manage. And if we take one thing away from this presentation today, it's about, well, what do we do to address this stuff from an early intervention perspective? What do we do to engage in those supports earlier to ensure that it's that we're giving ourselves a greater capacity to resolve the issue and get back to a better level of functioning? If we relate this to the current population, we know that 82% of financial advisors found the regulatory and compliance requirements of their roles highly or very highly stressful. And that challenge related to work pressures, work change or job changes, I should say, that's one of the common issues out there. But what are the ways that we work through these? Another useful way to look at this is the stress curve, otherwise known as the inverted U, or the individual optimal zone of functioning. So one of the reasons why I like to throw this slide up is it's a good way to think about the effect of our common issues that we may experience is by the level of stress they cause. You can see here that, as we know, we all have, or we all require a certain level of arousal or activation or stress to perform at our peak. We might call that the comfort zone there that you can see on the slide. But if we want to make sure that we're best managing that and we're learning ways to better manage stressors that we're associated with, we actually need time out of the comfort zone. We need time a little bit further down the continuum. And similarly, as most humans thrive on challenge, it's also really important that we spend some time to the right of that, up around the hump there, because that's where we're learning most. That's where we're sort of put outside our comfort zone, and we're experiencing things that challenge us. The critical consideration here is we don't want to be up outside our comfort zone for an extended period. We don't want to be up on top of that hump or over the right of it, because the more time we spend over there, the increased likelihood we will experience illness, ill health, exhaustion, burnout, those sort of things. And just like any muscle, which is essentially what our brain is, it needs its downtime. And the only way that we learn to sort of process the experiences and learn from those experiences that we're exposed to outside of our comfort zone is by getting down to the bottom of that stress curve where we have low arousal stress. Because down there is where we can do our best processing. Our brain has greater capacity. And that's where it does its reflective practice. That's where it does, it has the opportunity to identify what worked in that situation, what didn't work, what do I need to do differently. And importantly, the more we do that, the greater our capacity to do it in the future becomes. And critically, our capacity to manage stress moves along to the right there, the more we learn from those experiences. So again, if we think about this from how do we identify when someone's experiencing difficulty? If we look specifically at a male population, a useful way to think about it is what are the warning signs? What are the warning lights that might come up on our dashboard? And I think for this notion of idling high, the more time we spend idling high or to the right on our stress curve, the greater likelihood that we're going to experience distress, the greater likelihood we're going to experience illness. But critically, the more likely it is that we'll see signs. And some of these warning signs might be, distress or emotion suppression, which is essentially sort of, pushing things down and not verbalizing what you're experiencing, which will usually result in outbursts around anger, increased irritability, aggressive behavior. Somatic symptoms are there, and what we're talking about there is increased sleep or aches and pains, complaints about declining physical health. Risk-taking and impulsivity is another one. We see increased risky behaviour, dangerous driving, increased drug and alcohol use, drinking to excess it might be. And critically, when there's sort of those situations where there doesn't seem to be much care about the consequences of your actions. Now, a really useful way to think about that is, taking a moment to reflect for yourself. You think about those own periods of compromised well-being that you may have experienced, which are a normal occurrence. What do you experience? What do you do? What do you feel? What about over the last month? What behaviours do you see in the others that you know best? And that can be a really useful way to sort of take some time to identify, well, what is it that you experience? For me, when I'm stressed, what I get is this pain between my shoulder blades, and critically, that's a good sign that there's a level of physical tension in my body. Sleep's also affected, and this notion of 6 to 8 hours sleep a night might be a little bit unrealistic, but what are the ways that I can improve my sleep quality? And we'll talk about those a little bit later on. So we'll shift into this notion of what works and what doesn't. Notion of supporting the men in our lives, drawing on both those experiences of your own, but also the evidence base as well. And so another question for the panel out there is, again, I'd love to see some answers in the chat box, and Cam will help us communicate those. What are your thoughts on why people don't reach out for mental health support?
Stigma, pride, embarrassment. Interesting one here, Dr. David. It's ineffective. The old excuse of being time poor.
Yeah.
Weakness. Your upbringing. Some very strong terms being used in these comments. So I think it shows how people view things differently, but there's a common theme here.
Yeah, and one of the things that sort of jumped out at me there, Cam, as well is the sort of the gender norms that are associated with being a man, right? This notion of men are taught to be in control. It's perceived as a weakness, and ultimately, depending on the type of roles, that doesn't necessarily need to be gender specific. But one of the critical considerations here is, there's also value in thinking about what are the ways that we can approach this differently. And when sorry, I just got distracted by that last comment there. But when we see what the evidence tells us, that there is this notion that seeking mental health support is embarrassing. There is this notion that seeking mental health support isn't something that a bloke should do. And I guess one of the things that I'd love you to consider is what are the ways that you, at an individual level, can change those aspects, because the evidence tells us that there's a lot of barriers to seeking mental health support. The tyranny of time is one, and depending on our life stage, peak mental stress, peak relationship stress, peak family stress, peak parenting stress, peak work stress. They all often collude, and this results in the notion that I just don't have time. And we'll see that, late 30s through to 50s for the male population. The traditional masculine norms are another big one. And again, there's this perception that the behaviours based on being a man are about keeping emotion to yourself, accept anger, always being the leader, being in charge, toughing it out, even when it hurts. So it's critical that we think about how we shift this, because it's just like stigma. Gender norms, yes, they're ingrained because we learn through society and our own upbringing that might be the way to go, but we also have the capacity to change that over time. And if we look at some of the other areas here, a different way to look at this when we talk about knowledge and understanding from men, we might sort of argue that as a result of our upbringing, and I'm talking about, sort of it being a man here, that we don't have the skills to be able to talk about our challenges, because our go-to, what we saw in others, what we saw potentially in our role models, was anger was the thing that we showed. And so naturally, what we see is that's what we've learned to do. They're the behaviours that have been modelled. And so our capacity to talk through our challenges, to verbalize emotion is underdeveloped. And, you know, it's not necessarily that blokes can't or won't talk. Perhaps it's that they don't yet have the capability. And, you know, speaking as a psychologist that works primarily with men, but across sort of all genders, a lot of the time, the ability to learn about how to express the emotional effect of experience is something that is fairly consistent with those males that I work with. You know, the knowledge or understanding is another interesting one. You know, if we look at our site data for mental health, you know, 48% of those landing on our site are actually female. And so, you know, while a very small percentage may be looking for themselves, this anecdotal evidence that supports this notion that a number are looking for their partner, brother, friend, son, colleague. And, you know, when we start to sort of think about those around us seeing signs that we need support, you know, what's stopping us from acknowledging that? And critically, you know, to one of the points that was made there in the chat, you know, some men simply don't know when they're struggling and, you know, where to go for support. And, you know, I'll be the first to admit that there is some confusion or some inconsistency with accessing mental health support. And there's some requirements sort of from a governmental perspective to change that. But at the same time, there's resources out there that we know are effective and that are accessible if there's some persistence there. And we'll talk more about that a little bit later on. So I'd like to sort of flip over and think about sort of some good news to consider. You know, back to that stigma question or that stigma sort of concern, you know, there is a stigma in talking about mental health. I'd argue that maybe 15 years ago, there probably wouldn't be a session that was as well attended as this on mental health. I'd also argue that the data shows us that 10% increase in men seeking help over the past 10 years is a good sign. But there's also a great opportunity here to think about how your behaviour influences the behaviour of those around you. But to do it well, you know, it requires us to get comfortable with being uncomfortable. And for those Aussie Rules fans out there, you're probably familiar with a few coaches using that statement. But I think it's critical to identify that, you know, part of this process, we think that 43% of blokes that sought help from professionals, from peers, from family members, didn't get what they expected. There's actually an opportunity there for us to upskill. And I think that's an important consideration. This notion of a gendered lens is another one. We're seeing an increase in men's health specific services because just like there's requirements for you know, other genders to have specific health services, there's very much a need for men as well. And we're seeing an increase in those across across the profession and across the health services. So what do we do? You know, we've talked a little bit about the warning signs. You know, we've talked about, you know, what does and doesn't work, what the evidence tells us. And I think it's really important to sort of drill into this a little bit more. You know, what are the ways that we can support those experiencing distress? And I'd like to reiterate that this is adding to the current toolkit. It's considering a gendered lens as opposed to one size fits all approach. And I think it's really important for us to remember, regardless of who we're trying to support, it's worthwhile thinking about what are the individual differences for that person? What do you know about them? And how do you factor that into the way that you start a conversation with them? The first step is, of course, looking at the warning signs. And when we know people that well, you have a choice. You know, you can do something or you can sit on your hands and do nothing. Now, the critical thing here is, and this is often a barrier to people supporting, is they don't really know what to do or say. You know, and our advice here is, you know, keeping it simple. We like these 4 R's because it gives us those signposts along the way, and this is actually developed or extended on Lifeline's 3 R's. You know, we've added the reconnect on the end because I think that's an important part of supporting people, regardless of where they are in their, you know, in their experience of a period of compromised well-being or mental illness. And we'll throw the post or the link, I should say, to this resource that's available on our website that'll be included in the after session email. So The recognise. So let's think about this. We know the person fairly well. We know what normal behaviour is for the person. So what is the behaviour change? What have we noticed? What are the things that you've seen or heard that have made you concerned? You know, what are those warning lights that are flashing on the individual's dashboard? You know, are they normally quite an engaged person? Normally happy to have a chat to you when they get home from work, or you know, when you call them up on the weekend. But recently that hasn't been happening. You know, when and where are you going to have the conversation? You know, what do you know about the individual? Are they sort of a bit of an open book, or are they a little bit more reserved and keen to, you know, keep these sort of things fairly close hold? Thus, you know, are you having a conversation at a coffee shop, or are you sort of choosing a place that might be a little more private, if you like? Importantly, what are your referral options? You know, who might you suggest if this individual needs a little bit of additional support? And that's not necessarily overly complicated. It's just sort of thinking about, well, you know, is this something that I might sort of encourage them to get in touch with the crisis line about? Is this something that we might sort of, the next step might be going to the GP? And a lot of the time we won't know that until we have the conversation. But sometimes it's worth just having a few ideas in your back pocket because it allows you to feel a little bit more comfortable walking into this situation. And critically, you know, this notion of starting the conversation, you know, you're never going to get it 100% right, but the reality is practice makes progress. You know, there's this notion that we need to get comfortable with being uncomfortable, and sometimes, you know, that requires us to sort of lean into some of that distress or discomfort that we may be experiencing. So what are the ways that we, you know, engage in the conversation? Of course, we want to act early. And critically, you know, this isn't about fixing the problem, but it's about having, you know, or providing, I should say, a reliable support option, you know, a reliable link in the change to help the person get back on their feet. One of the things that works well with, stereotypically with men is this notion of activity-based. You know, is it something you can do on a walk? Is it something, you know, if it's your significant other, is it something you can do working in the garden? You know, sitting out on the back deck, you know, or you're having a cup of tea or something else in the afternoon. You know, what are those environments that may feel less confrontational? And the reason I say that is because as a result of, you know, again, I'm talking from a male's perspective, as a result of our often less developed capacity to talk about emotion and challenge, sometimes statements that sound critical will lead to defensiveness. And it might be, Dave, you're just not right, or you seem a lot more snappy than you are normally. And, you know, if I'm a little bit wound up, you know, I might misinterpret that because it's sort of highlighting that I don't yet have the skills to discuss. You know, it's sort of triggering my flight response. You know, there's a threat there. And so time and space can be really useful here. You know, there's an example of how you might start the conversation there. The key consideration for mine is, well, how do you call out the behaviours that have made you concerned? How do you sort of identify them as opposed to saying, you know, are you okay? Or Dave, you're not yourself. You know, what is it that's made you think that? And how do you sort of highlight that as part of your concern? And critically, we know that these are never a one and done conversation. And so if you're opening the convo here and you sort of get waved away, or you get shut down, it's really useful to think about, well, how do you reconnect? Because, you know, at times starting the conversation needs to be the first step, and then a day or two later, it might be revisiting the conversation. And reconnecting is a critical part of that. Dave, I hear you don't want to talk about it right now, and that's okay, but I want to make sure that you're okay and that we're doing what we can for you. Let's check in a day and see if we can pick up some other ideas. Now, when you say that, what you're doing is you're promoting to me that you know, there is a level of concern there and you want to do something about it. So ultimately, when you organise a reconnect, it's really important that you sort of follow through with that as well. The other critical consideration when we're talking about the response, I mentioned this earlier, you know, it's not about you solving the problem. The other really important thing to highlight here is, you know, giving your attention ensuring that you're sort of engaged is really, really important. So, no jumping on your phone and texting, no sort of shut down body language or avoiding eye contact. Intermittent eye contact is good, of course. And the critical thing here is what is useful when people are experiencing distress is assisting them in verbalizing what's been bouncing around upstairs, what's been bouncing around in their brain. When you give them that opportunity, it can often assist with the processing of the experience of what they're stuck on. And that is a really useful way to think about the purpose of the conversation. It's not necessarily about you providing a solution. It's about you providing a context or an environment where people feel comfortable talking. And we all have the capacity to do that. So who do we refer to? We've got care, don't carry up there, because that's sort of re-emphasizing, this notion that it's not all on you. The critical part about caring for others is about ensuring that you're part of the support process and you're linking them in with the professionals. It's not you yourself being the professional support. This notion of identifying options is critical, because people will be more likely to make change when, when they come up with, or they feel like they've come up with some ideas themselves. And so these coaching questions are really useful. Who's been a good support for you in the past? What's worked for you previously? I know going to the gym is something that's important to you, and you haven't been doing that recently. What's getting in the way, or how might you restart that? And critically, if you're unsure, how can I best support you right now? Because that can be a really useful way to highlight to the individual that, they're not as isolated or as alone as they think they are. And often when we're experiencing periods of ill health or illness, that's one of the key factors that goes along with it. So we talk about the notion of support options. There's always sort of a continuum here, if you like. It's should always be first and foremost mates, family, trusted people, others. And we talk about others there. We've got a link to Mr. Perfect's men's health directory, and there's a range of social support groups that are available through Mr. Perfect. And if that's something that is lacking for the individual that you're supporting, it might be a useful option. Reliable resources, another great self-help resource is the Heads Up Guys website. And I'd encourage you to go and have a look at that. It's got some really useful information on it. Obviously, your GP to access a mental health plan or a mental health treatment plan. And then, of course, looking at your mental health professionals that may use a gendered approach, depending on the individual that you're supporting. The crisis support lines is an interesting one. We've got EAP in there because that's traditionally where EAP are viewed. I would argue that EAP should be able to provide a greater level of early intervention and prevention psych support as opposed to just crisis support. But there might be other services that would be better placed to provide that have a higher level of expertise. And of course, I mentioned some of the crisis lines there. Men's lines are a really useful one for a gendered approach. You've got Lifeline and the suicide callback service that a lot of people talk about getting benefit from. But again, this is rarely a one-size-fits-all approach. So it's about what works for the individual and how do you work with them to test and adjust or to try get them to try different things. So, this notion of reconnecting is a critical fourth step of the 4 R's. It's about, I don't want to say holding the individual to account, but it's about highlighting more so that you're keen to assist them in getting better, to moving, potentially from the lower half of that diagram that we spoke about at the start, Keys's mental health, mental illness diagram, up into the top quadrants there on the right. And so, coming up with a plan and talking about how you might follow up, the nurture and nudge over nag is a useful way to frame it. It's more about your concern over criticism, avoiding those shoulds and musts, because often there's some negative associations with that. And the notion of care don't carry again. And I think, depending on the person that you're supporting, this isn't about sort of carrying their weight of the world on your shoulders. And often, excuse me, when we talk about people not wanting to burden others with what's going on for them, the data and the research actually shows us that rarely is providing support to others burdensome. What it actually does is it increases this notion of social connection and social support, when there's this acknowledgement that that's not the only resource they should be using. And, that can be a really useful way to think about it. The other thing that I wanted to highlight when we talk about reconnection again I wanted to reiterate, is this notion that it's rarely a one and done conversation. Regardless of context, it's important to be prepared to one, encounter a little bit of resistance at times, but two, also, acknowledge that there'll be a few conversations about working with an individual to get them back on track. And, depending on how long they've been experiencing this for, it might take a little while. And for mine, that really highlights the importance of asking the questions early, as opposed to leaving it until stuff's gone really pear-shaped. Because, like any sort of illness, the longer it's left unchecked, the harder the road is back to a better level of well-being. So when we talk about looking after your own mental health, I think, again, we reiterate that this is about adding to your current toolkit and sort of, thinking about ways that you might enhance your own mental health or your own well-being. And a lot of the time, as our lifestyles change, we're required to learn to do things differently. Unfortunately, what I used to do for physical activity as a 20-year-old is no longer available to me as a early 40s male. And so, from that context, it's really important that we take the time to think about what needs to change and test and adjust different things. But the question I'd like to throw out there to you all is, when you, again, for the chat box, what are you doing when your mental health is at its best? It can be either at work or away from work. Pretty blurred lines these days. But yeah, I'd love to hear some suggestions. When you feel most mentally healthy, what are the things that you're doing that allow you to maintain that? Some great ideas there. Cam's on mute, so I'll take these ones. Engaging with friends, coffee, externalizing. Bushwalking is a good one. Another outdoors activity there.
I think, couldn't get myself off mute there. Sorry, rookie error. I think, a lot of people do exercise, and I think that's coming through in a lot of these chat comments. Even just going out for a simple walk, getting some fresh air and some sunshine. Yeah, I think it's really good. The other sort of the other consistent theme there is social activities as well, social support. Whether that's physical activity or whether that's sort of other things. Music, art is another one. Learning, I think, is a really good one to highlight. We're built. Our brain is built to continue to learn regardless of our age, and a lot of the time, I think we forget that. How do we sort of fit this notion of growth and learning into what we're doing? So I wanted to revisit the stress curve, because I think it's really useful to remember that the strategies that we're talking about, these things that allow us to maintain or build and maintain our mental health, noting it's all about an adaptive positive thing here, is also the ways that we usually get out of sort of that distress. If we're experiencing a level of overstress, those things like getting out in nature, like catching up with friends, like physical activity, all those things are also stress relievers, and they're the things that allow us to get down the other side of the stress curve, where our brain can do what it needs to do and process the information that it's been exposed to, that it might be causing challenge. And so
it's useful to think about the intent of why you're doing these things. Yes, there's the physiological benefits, but there's also the processing benefits. There's the learning benefits that come with trying different things, trying different strategies to see what works for you, and figuring out what are the best options that'll assist you in moving forward. And I'm not going to spend a huge amount of time on these. What I'd love to do is sort of suggest these as areas that you might want to explore, and leave you to do your own exploration here as well, because in 45 minutes it's not a huge opportunity to cover this stuff in detail. But when we talk about the 4 key pillars, if you like, of mental health and building and maintaining your own mental health, I come back to this notion of doing. It's this action orientation. Those things that provide opportunities for your development. It requires continued work. We're exposed to new environments, and that bloody pandemic thing is a great example where we've continually had to adjust to different expectations. There's changing jobs, there's learning new skills. So it's really important to think about what are the things that you can do that challenge you, that you enjoy and allow you to grow, noting that the people around you need to be supportive and facilitative as well. That might be different in a work perspective. There might be other resources that you want to incorporate. But when we talk about personal values as an example, noting that these 4 areas overlap, I think it's really important to highlight that, again, we come back to this notion of change over the lifespan. And again, what I find most sustaining and what's most important to me currently is very different to what it was 5 years ago. And so it's important that I'm taking the time to think about that and identify, well, what are the things that I need to do regularly that align with what I see as most important in my life. From an ongoing development perspective, the research tells us that those that are flourishing are more confident and energized, are better able to respond to challenges and recover quicker from the demands of their work. But I would ask, well, what are the ways that you maintain your development? What are the ways that you do learn from your experience? Noting that there's always great learning opportunities from both the good and the bad experiences, but we'll often focus just on the bad. The arousal management, again, back to our stress curve. What are the things that we do to get out of high stress? What are the things that allow our brain the opportunity to process the information that it's been exposed to? Because again, that's its job. And if we're not giving it the space to do that, we're increasing the load, we're increasing the burden on that muscle. And we saw the great suggestions from a health and wellbeing perspective and socialising. I would encourage you to think about, in light of how you are and how you live now, what are opportunities to move regularly, eat effectively, get the rest that you can or that you need, and critically that social support, because we know that for mental health and and protecting against mental ill health and illness, social support is a key protective factor. And that doesn't mean that we need 15 really good friends. What it means is we need to identify what is necessary for us and how do we ensure that we're maintaining that, because there's a lot of positive benefits that come with having good social support. So second to last slide here, folks, I think this is a really useful diagram, if you can call it that, drawing, that highlights the way that we have traditionally learned to work isn't as conducive to our self-care, our productivity, our performance as we may have thought. And what the research tells us is when we're looking at the aspects of life that sustain us outside of work, and doing those on a regular basis, what it allows us to do is increase our capacity to perform, increase our capacity to be productive. And so when we're scheduling that stuff in, we're giving ourselves an opportunity to be more effective in the time that we commit to work. So what are our resources? We've spoken about these, so I'm not going to go in a huge amount of detail. There'll be some links on the end of seminar email that gets sent out to you. What I would say is that these resources, some will work for some of those that you're supporting yourselves, others will be more effective. What we often see is people will sort of try something and then, say, well, that didn't work. It's no good fixing this. If we go back to our notion of those 4 pillars of mental health, what are the things that we're continuing to doing to improve our ongoing development? And that often looks at exploring multiple factors as opposed to just trying 1 or 2 or persisting with something that's not working. So I'd really encourage you to do that. And that's the last slide from me. We'll throw it over to the Q&A there, Cam.
Yeah, thanks, Dr. David. There's no Q&As that have come through at the moment, so if you've got any from the audience, please submit them. But I think the key learnings out of that is it's not a one-size-fits-all approach. We are all wired differently. I think you use that terminology through the presentation, and what works for me may not work for you. But I think it's you've got to have balance. I think balance is key, whether it's, socializing, exercise, reading, relaxing, friends. I think it's, what works for each of us is slightly different, but, you will figure out what works for yourself and just, keep looking after yourself. I think it's the key message out of this.
Yeah, I think it's a really good point, Cam. And again, it's sort of this notion that and I don't mean this to be dismissive or belittling, but this notion of sort of being adaptable according to our life stage is critical. And stereotypically, blokes are will often make comparisons with themselves of 20 years ago, and it's rare that you can do what you did 20 years ago from a physical activity perspective, right? So I think it's really important that we're constantly looking for ways to improve our well-being and maintain our mental health, and that comes through trial and error, and we're all capable of doing that if we're okay with being a little bit uncomfortable.
Yeah, interesting questions come through. When is medication needed as part of a mental health plan versus developing tools?
Yeah, great question. So what I would say to that is what the research tells us is rarely is medication alone effective. I would encourage anyone that's thinking about medication to have a review with their GP, but also look at getting a referral to a psychologist as well, and identifying whether that's something that is critical or whether it's something that can be a good benefit. Ultimately, what is most effective for people experiencing long-term mental illness is a combination of medication and psychological therapy. But often when we're talking about sort of low-level, I shouldn't say low-level mental illness, but sort of periods of compromised well-being, medication is a band-aid that doesn't really fix what's going on underneath. And there's a lot more value in utilising sort of psych support or counselling support instead.
Yep. Very good question coming up for you. How long do you wait for someone to be ready to seek mental health support, given that this person has previously said they are open to it, but just not ready now? Or not, sorry, but not ready just now.
Yeah. So, yeah, look, that's how long is a piece of string? I would say, and thanks for being open there for the question. I would say that if there's a barrier to them seeking support, it's probably about identifying what that barrier is. Like if I'm not ready now, is it because I don't think I have the time? Is it because I'm not keen to have a chat to a psychologist? Is it, is there other reasons that I'm sort of using that as an excuse to not engage? I would say, the trying to identify what the barrier is a useful sort of exploration there for the question, as opposed to sort of just sort of being fobbed off like that. I hope that helps.
There's no more questions come through or comments in the chat, so we might just give people 30 seconds before we wrap up. But, I think really great, insightful conversation today, Dr. David. And it's, we all come up against barriers through our life, whether it's work related, family related, relationship related. And, I think men historically and probably in the future will still be very hard to talk to and crack open. And I think you've given people some really good tools and some thoughts around how they can help themselves and help those around them to live a good and fruitful life. So one other question that's come through. We talk about emotion, which is a very good comment, actually. We've talked about emotional abuse with females, but does it occur with men often?
In what direction? Yeah, look, I think it can. We talk about this notion, and we talk about this notion of domestic and family violence, and I think one of the challenges is men will be less likely to seek support when they're experiencing that. So we don't actually have really clear data or stats as to how often it occurs. But knowing the human condition and the reality of the complexity of relationships, I would say that yes, it does occur with men. How frequently is really hard to say, but I know it does occur.
Another question's come through on a bit of a roll now. Does talking about it again and again with no action from the person help? Or when do you give up trying to help them? Or is this nagging?
Yeah, thank you. So the question about how much is too much, I would say it'd be about switching the focus. Again, what's stopping them from making change? There is this belief that you don't want to kick a dead horse, to pardon the vernacular, and ultimately there's probably a point where you want to stop. But I would be always encouraging you to think about, well, what's a different way to discuss this that is about encouraging the individual to identify what are the ways that they can make changes as opposed to just talk. Because yes, it's an important part of the process, but part of talking is about identifying strategies or opportunities to change what it is that you're doing, as opposed to just sort of continuing to go over the same stuff again and again. If that's happening, they're not feeling heard, or they're not sort of, there's a requirement to get additional professional support, I would say.
Yep. And one final question, keeping an eye on time. Should people avoid wallowing with others sharing the same workplace issues? Does it create a negative spiral that isn't healthy? That issue has been around for a long time, hasn't it? And I think it's a fair question to ask.
Yeah, look, I would say that wallowing, you get more of what you pay attention to is a really useful way to say that. So if we're in an environment, and this can be workplace, it can be social, if we're in an environment where there's a lot of focus on what's not working, the world sucks, whatever it might be, then I would encourage a changing of dialogue to ensure that we're actually not focusing on that anymore. How we do that, if it's a cultural thing, it requires a little bit of work, but the reality is, if we get more of what we pay attention to, we need to be really conscious about the information that we're putting out there, especially at a workplace level, at a leader level, whatever it might be, and thinking about how do we change the dialogue, because that just doesn't benefit one or two people, it benefits the team. And there's a range of strategies that we can do that. It just requires a little bit of investigation.
Yeah. Well, given we're nearly out of time, on behalf of the AFA and our members, Dr. David, I'd like to thank you for your very informative presentation today. For our members, the webinar will be available to view on our website. So if you want to revisit it at some point in time, please feel free to do so. And CPD certificates will be sent out within a week or so for those members who have attended. So once again, thank you very much, Dr. David, and we look forward to working with you again in the future.
It's a pleasure. Take care, Cam, and take care all out there. Appreciate your time.
Thank you.